I made a podcast about 2.5 days ago that apparently already has about over 100 views. So it's on pace to be one of my most viewed podcasts, which is a little surprising because it's one of the solo ones. And my first solo one from week before last, or from last week, got 21 views. And this one already has 108 views. And so I think if I go and look at my all the my different podcasts here, the video interviews of my faith science podcast. My very first one with Moise DeRozier got 156 views, and there's not been another one that's gone over 100. The next one was 89 views, and then it dropped off after that. And so the one with Dr. Bo from several weeks ago got 80 something views, and the one with Dr. Don got 70 something views. But generally, I was seeing anywhere from like 11 views with Thomas Fanner a couple weeks ago to closer to 37, 38. That was what was normal. It's really dropped off since those first 4 weeks. And so this week I did a video called The Genesis 1 Creation Days Were Literal 24-hour days. And that one has gotten 108 views, which is a little surprising. What's even more surprising is that people have been really engaging with it. So there's been all of these comments. And so I am making a video now to respond to some of these comments live. So I haven't even looked at what the new comments are. I responded to a couple of comments this morning. And so I thought, well, okay, those people will probably comment back. But this morning, I think the video was at something like 70 views, and now it's up to like almost 110. And so, again, we're going to go through. This is going to be fun to take a look at some of these comments. Some of them might be pretty short. There was somebody that called my video cringe, the podcast video cringe, and then I had somebody comment and said SMH because I thanked the person with the cringe comment for the cringe comment. And my thought is, well, hey, they didn't have to comment. And the commenting, I believe, actually helps with the engagement of the video. So that it's actually helpful to me if you come on and say that what I did was cringe. The thing about it is, I don't know whether or not they think it's cringe because they don't like the sound of my voice, whether they think that me doing a Loom video really isn't a podcast, so that's cringy, or what. They didn't really say. They just said so cringe. And so, of course, they could be saying that because they don't like the content, but they didn't say what they didn't like. So I don't take it personally. So let's go ahead and take a look um, at these comments here. These are under the video. So we're going to go down. Well, actually, what I prefer to do is go to YouTube Studio and answer them one by one. So we're going to do that. And yeah, view more. Then that would be here. So there are some people that faith and science are not compatible at all. Okay, so let's just hide this. So I saw that there were like 9 comments. So this is, so let's see. Congrats on shortening your video. Now take the next step and just say, God did it. Boom, you are done. Um, yeah. I don't know exactly what that's referring to. It's obviously the video that, it's obviously the Genesis 1 creation days were literal 24-hour days. So congrats on shortening your video. Again, I don't know what that means exactly, but the belief in God doesn't necessarily have to conflict with science. However, the research and published scientific works on areas like geology, biology, cosmology, radiometric dating, nuclear decay rate that doesn't align with either the biblical account or with the biblical timeline. Personally, the God of the early Hebrews and subsequently the God of Christianity could be true, but there are many things that don't align with the science today. You mentioned that you don't believe in evolution, but I'm sure you know that biodiversity as possible with reproduction and natural mutations that leads to speciation, like the various dog breeds, which are ultimately related to wolf breeds, but you wouldn't subscribe to humans being related to chimpanzees, which we share over 90% DNA in common. My personal thought on the Torah and the books and letters that comprise what is known as the New Testament is mostly ancient stories trying to understand the meaning of life, how to govern Bronze Age people, parables about life. If the Hebrew God created everything, the Genesis account could have been the best way to describe it to a group of people that wouldn't understand concepts such as gravitational fields or laws of thermodynamics or chemistry. I wish you well. I can tell you that you believe you are speaking truth and that the world confirms it. So this is so I appreciate this comment from Junebug Computer. I don't think they're looking for a back and forth here, but I appreciate the comment. What I would say about this is that there is research and published scientific stuff that doesn't align with the biblical account or the biblical timeline, and the answer for a lot of that is that people make assumptions that don't align with the biblical account or the biblical timeline. So if you start off with assumptions that are atheistic, for instance, or materialistic, for instance, that cannot allow for the possibility of a creator, then you come up with answers that are just like that. And so the next thing that was mentioned here, so yes, there are many things that don't align with what I would say quote unquote science, because there are a lot of things that are called science that really are not science. And so things like geology, for instance, it's not to say that geology isn't science, but geology relies heavily on assumptions, because what you're essentially doing is you're trying to say what happened in the past. And if we're going to make a assertion about what happened in the past, then we have to make assumptions about that. And if the assumptions we make are assumptions that say, well, we must not allow for there to be something like a global flood, for instance, then you're going to get answers that mean, oh, it's not a global flood, despite whatever evidence to the contrary is out there. And we see evidence all over the globe that there was a global flood. And so you can go on basically whatever mountain you want to, and you can find marine fossils there. And the question is how does such a thing happen if there was not water up there? And so this is, you could have answers for that, but your answers are generally based on there wasn't a global flood, instead of saying, well, what if there was, and would this line up with that? And so there are some people that, there was someone I was commenting back and forth with that would call that presuppositional. I would not. I would say that in that case, what we're saying is look at all of the options rather than excluding certain options and being biased against certain options. And then when you're biased against something and then you eliminate it as an option, you say, well, that's science, but that isn't science. So yes, there are things that don't align with the biblical account, and then there are all of these things that do. And what happens is those things get excluded from textbooks, and those things get excluded from what you're taught. So, for example, we talked about radiometric dating in the podcast with Dr. Don DeYoung, and we talked about how you can find carbon 14 in diamonds. Now, the question is, how do you find carbon 14 in diamonds if they are as old as they are said to be? Now, if we understand how carbon 14 works and that it decays over time, so that there should be no carbon 14 in the diamonds, and this is what the rate team and Dr. Don were told when they took diamonds to the lab, and these people said, we don't need to check diamonds for carbon 14 because they're diamonds and they're this old, so therefore there's no carbon 14. And they said, well, please check them anyway. And then the people found carbon 14 in there. And now they're saying, well, hold on a second. And so my point is that is radiometric dating evidence for a more recent created Earth. But what do we do with that evidence? Or what happens to that kind of evidence? What happens to evidence where we see soft tissue in dinosaur bones? What happens to that evidence? Well, that doesn't align with the evolutionary worldview. It doesn't align with the evolutionary account. And so what do we do with it? Well, there are people that will try to explain that away. But again, if we're talking about millions of years, then from everything we understand about carbon 14, there should be none in these diamonds or in coal, for instance. But there is. And they checked it over and over again. And there's no mistake here. So you have a worldview or a thought process or a thought about the way the world works that was based on evolution. And there was a prediction that's made. No carbon 14 should be in here. Then you have a separate worldview, the creation account of a young Earth. And they said there should be carbon 14 here because these things aren't as old as has been said. These things are thousands of years old, not billions or millions. So you have two separate hypotheses. And then you go to the evidence. The evidence says, oh, wait a minute. There is carbon 14 here. Now that is evidence in favor of the second hypothesis. And so so to completely reject that hypothesis out of hand and say, well, no, we can't have that. Same thing with dinosaur bones. If we find dinosaur bones, that we look at that evidence that there's soft tissue inside. Now, there's a worldview that says, hey, dinosaur bones are millions of years old, so there should be no soft tissue inside. Everything we know about biology says there should be no soft tissue inside. But there's another hypothesis that says that the world is only thousands of years old. And so there very well could or should be soft tissue inside of a dinosaur bone. So one hypothesis actually lines up with the evidence and the others is not. And so my point is, if you completely negate that second hypothesis and never allow for it to be a possibility, then you take the evidence and you say, well, it can't be that thing. It's still this, even though this hypothesis did not predict accurately the evidence that we came across. And so if I'm thinking about which hypothesis I want to go to, the one that has predictive power would be the one we generally scientifically go with. The hypothesis that results in a prediction that when we go back and look at the evidence lines up with that prediction is generally what we should go with. And again, we're seeing more and more of this. That brings me to evolution. I mentioned I don't believe in evolution. Yes, I don't. The fact is you have to believe in it because it is not observable. Macroevolution is not observable by anyone's definition. You do not observe one thing giving birth to or giving rise to something else. That is something you have to believe in. And so it is literally their God of the gaps. There are these gaps between different types of species, and they believe evolution is the reason for those gaps. So macroevolution is God of the gaps. And so biodiversity is possible with reproduction and natural mutations. Okay, so what that means is that there is the ability for, let's say, a dog, various dog breeds, to have changes over time. The question, but that's not the question. No one disputes microevolution. Nobody does, because we see it. And so we saw this. And so when you read Darwin's On the Origin of Species, the issue that Darwin had is that he extrapolated. He looked at things like dog breeds and he extrapolated that out to saying that everything has a common ancestor. And you have to believe in that. You have to believe that because you cannot observe it. And so, yes, dogs can be related to wolves. What we would say, the biblical term here is that there are different kinds that God made at the beginning. And within those kinds, there is the possibility, and we see biodiversity. What we don't see is a single-celled organism turning into a plant turning into animals. We don't see whales turning into chimps or chimps turning into humans. You have to believe in that. That has to be your God where you believe that. And so to say that there's science for that, it's just not. And this mechanism specifically of natural mutations is the X-Men story. That's what this is. It's mutants. It's science fiction. The idea that mutations, that you just accumulate a bunch of mutations and create a better organism, is science fiction. And so Darwin didn't know anything about the cell or about DNA specifically. And so the things that Darwin didn't know, if he knew them, I find it difficult to believe that he would have even put this forth as a theory. But he just didn't know anything. And so it seemed plausible to extrapolate. And for those who are atheistic, uh, it is something that gives them an ability to say, hey, this is the way it could have happened. And I'm fine with you saying that that's a hypothesis, but it just has it's just fraught with so many problems that even atheistic scientists are saying, hey, wait a minute, there's got to be some other mechanism because the mutations thing doesn't work. I did work with something called genetic algorithms in my when I was working in the lab in graduate school for engineering, and we used this idea of genetic algorithms to it was a computer science method. But the problem with genetic algorithms is that you would have to turn up the rate of mutations, right? If there are a bunch of mutations occurring, what that generally results in is disease and death. And so you don't want mutations are not a good thing, but somehow the evolutionary story is that mutations are good. But if I tells you, oh, there's a mutation in the DNA, you don't go, oh, good. So that there's going to be a better this child that has this mutation in their DNA. That's a good thing. We all know that's not the case. When a doctor's telling you that your child has some mutation in their DNA, you don't get excited about it. You go, oh, what's wrong? Because that's exactly how it works. That 99 point whatever percent of the time, mutations are harmful. And maybe there are some where it's neutral potentially, or they're either harmful or neutral, let's say 99 point whatever percent of the time. But if you're having a bunch of mutations, it's going to result in problems, not some kind of ability to have some kind of superhuman power, which is what the X-Men is about. So this is what evolution is about. It's literally X-Men is what you're saying is happening or happened, but you have nothing to point to. You have to just believe in it. And if someone like me questions it, well, you don't believe in evolution? What's wrong with you? It's like, well, that's your religion. I mean, go ahead, but it's just not mine. And it makes a whole lot more sense to believe that these things were created when we look at the information, for example, in DNA. The idea that information in DNA arose by some kind of random natural process. Where does that happen? In our experience, information comes from a mind. Someone makes information. When we look at the human body, which is what I studied for my work with developing AI controllers for humanoid robots, when we look at that, what we see is that there's the human body is a system of systems, is what we would call it in mechanical engineering. It's a system of systems. And there are all of these parts that are working together. It has one of the most amazing things about the human body is self-healing. Now I ask you, how does self-healing, which involves all of these different systems of the human body, how does such a thing arise? There are all kinds of things like this. And what you can say is, well, it just happened. That's you're free to believe that. It just happened. You're free to look at information that has arisen and the fact that you have a system of communication in DNA and in the cell. You can look at that system and say that it arose by natural means. You're free to do that. Just don't ask me to, because as an engineer, that's not how systems come up, especially not systems that work. You might have something that doesn't work that comes about from natural processes or from random means. But you don't have the thing that works that does that. And so when it didn't work, because again, the assumption is it didn't work and then it did. So what happened to all of those organisms for which it didn't work? Well, they would have died. And so how do you eventually get to something that does work? And then how does that continue to, when you start getting into the details of it, even the questions I'm trying to ask, it just becomes unintelligible. It doesn't make any sense. So yes, I would not subscribe to humans being related to chimpanzees, which we share over 90% DNA in common. Right. What do we do with the fact that humans and chimpanzees share over 90% of the DNA? One thing we could do is we could say, well, that must mean they must have a common ancestor. It could also mean that they have a common creator. I make, I write computer code. It's part of what I do. I take code all the time in later programs that I've written before because it worked. So the idea that the creator should somehow use completely different code for chimpanzees as he does with humans. Why? We don't do that. I know I don't. When I'm writing code, if I have a piece of code that works, I'll use that and modify it for the thing that I want to do. So commonalities in organisms is simply evidence of a common creator, not evidence of a common ancestor. And so you need to show that a common ancestor, you really have to show that something like a chimpanzee could give birth to something that's different than a chimpanzee, because we don't observe it ever. So this is not observational science. This is not what we would call science. Becomes a philosophy that you believe when it comes to evolution. You have to believe that. So um, when it comes to the Torah, I think there are plenty of people that have a similar thought about the Torah, that it is simply good stories that, or there are these stories that really uh, reflect a sense of how people would have wanted to view the world. So that's a common, I wouldn't say it's, well, it is common. It's common for people to view it that way. We don't want to call it inspired. We don't want to call it something that comes from God. We would rather say that it's just something that has nice stories. And so the idea, again, going back to science, is this is the best way to describe it to a group of people that wouldn't understand concepts such as gravitational fields or laws of thermodynamics or chemistry. By the way, we see hints at laws of thermodynamics, for example, in the scriptures, the idea of entropy, for instance, that things are running more and more towards disorder and chaos over time. There's a passage in Hebrews 1 that talks about this, that things wax old like a garment. This idea of entropy over time is reflected in the scripture. So there are things like that. But there's this fundamental issue here where people think that this book should be a science book somehow, and that's not what it's supposed to be. And so even now, when you read Genesis 1 and 2, it explains things very well. Whether you're talking about people that lived 3 or 4,000 years ago, or you're talking about people that live today, it explains things very well. It shouldn't, the idea that God telling you how he did things should actually break it down to the thermodynamics and chemistry. If he really broke it down and told you exactly how he did it, do you really think you'd be able to understand a transcendent super intelligence? You think he's really going to be able to explain to you in a way? First of all, our understanding of thermodynamics and chemistry is just how we understand it now. So you're wanting him to explain things in a way that you, in your limited understanding, would be able to understand it, rather than him explaining it the way he did, that this is what he did on day one, this is what he did on day two, this is what he did on day three. But telling you about the creation of laws of such as thermodynamics and chemistry is not necessary. And would you really understand it? I think sometimes we elevate ourselves in the sense that, oh, there should be more science stuff in there in the Bible. And I just don't think that's the case. This was a good comment. It was good to kind of think through that. And so, yes, the belief in God doesn't necessarily have to conflict with science. Now, the issue is that there are plenty of people that say, of course, it conflicts with science. And what I would say to those people is, you're not recognizing your bias. You're not recognizing that science began with believers. So you don't even understand the history. So to say that faith science is an oxymoron, which is, I think we're going to come to that next. Well, so here, if a God exists, finding conclusive evidence for that would be the most important question to answer. Why in the history of humanity, every God that has been believed in has either been discarded or insufficient evidence is all we have? Why is God hiding? Why is it impossible to have definitive evidence a God, actually your God, exists? So that's a good question. This idea that God is hiding, but again, if we have this book that comes from God, He's not hiding. He's given us the scriptures. So this is why we discuss the scriptures. My question to this person would be, Walter 6574, what does conclusive evidence mean? What does that mean exactly? Because when we start getting into the brass tacks of, okay, what would conclusive evidence mean? Does he need to make a personal appearance to you, for instance? Is that what he needs? Is it that he needs to write out his name in the stars or something like that? Because generally, what we've been seeing recently is that atheists have been asked that question. Okay, what is the evidence that you need to prove that God exists? And then all of a sudden, the atheist says something like, "Well, I can't think of anything," because anything that you think of they would chalk it up to being a hallucination. So let's say God appeared to them. Well, that must be a hallucination. Well, let's say God wrote his name out in the stars. That would be hallucination. But if we look at something like DNA, you you have volumes and volumes of information inside of a single molecule of DNA. What is that if it's not evidence of a higher power and intelligence? Because we don't see information produced through random natural processes. We just don't see it. And so when we see information, there's a mind behind that. So what is that? If there's DNA there. When we look at the universe, when we look at the anthropic principle, which is the idea that this earth is uniquely fitted for humans to live here. Now, there are people that will say, well, there are people that would argue against that, but it is that if the earth is a little bit farther away from the sun, then we freeze to death. If it's a little bit closer to the sun, we burn to death. We look at things like I was doing an interview this week with somebody who talked about how the human body has these self-healing properties. And so that if we feed it the right things, it will heal itself. How, how do we account for there being an environment here on Earth that's just right for humans, that we eat the right foods, we have healthy lives? How do we account for that? And so the way you can account for it is just to say it just happened and all of this is a figment of our imagination. But if you're searching, hopefully, Walter, you're searching, finding conclusive evidence for that would be the most important question to answer. Yes, let's look for conclusive evidence of that. But let's start with there's a higher power. There is a supreme intelligence that's responsible for this. And if you don't see that, then that's where I would start for you. If you can't see through DNA, through the design of the human body, if you don't see design out here, and in our experience, again, my background is engineering design. When you see design, there must be a designer. It's that simple. And we see a designer of supreme intelligence when we look at something like the DNA molecule, when you look at something like the system of the cell, and we look at how cells can become. Again, I'm not a biologist, but when you see all of these different systems, and the deeper you go, the smaller you look, there's more. And then when you widen your lens, there's more. There's a supreme intelligence that's responsible for this. And if you deny that, then you have a bigger problem, because what do you say? How do you reconcile this, the evidence that we see here? And if your answer is, well, it could have just come about naturally, well, then that's what you have to do. You have to begin with something like the Big Bang, energy and matter exploding into existence from nothing. So nothing produced all of this. That's what you have to believe. You then have to believe in abiogenesis. You have to believe that there was non-life, a bunch of matter out here, and then life sprang into existence. Again, just no deliberation there, no thought behind it, no external action, just life popped into existence. Now again, neither one of these things are things that we observe. We do not observe matter and energy popping into existence from nothing. That's actually the first law of thermodynamics. Energy can be neither created or destroyed. That's the first law of thermodynamics. So you have to believe, if you believe in like a Big Bang where everything exploded into existence from nothing, you have to now contradict the first law of thermodynamics to believe that. Then you have to contradict the law of biogenesis, meaning the law of biogenesis says that life comes from non-life. But you have to believe in abiogenesis. You have to believe that at some point that all of this matter that popped into existence from nothing, then it was non-living, and then life popped out of it. That's what you have to believe. So that's the opposite of the law of biogenesis. These are laws from science. These are not hypotheses. These are laws. Then you have to believe that now this life that popped into existence from nothing, which we have no idea, we've never observed such a thing happen. Now this life somehow some simple forms of life that somehow popped into existence from out of non-life, that they become more complex over time and become the biodiversity that we see today with no kind of external action on it. There was no uh, there's no deliberation behind it. It just happened. Now, we observe neither one of those. We observe none of those three things. So to believe in them means you have to believe in it and say that that's what happened, even though we don't observe it. On the other hand, what we are saying is no, matter and energy didn't come into existence from nothing. There was someone who brought matter and energy into existence. So it wasn't that nothing brought matter and energy into existence. It is that God brought matter and energy into existence. We don't say that life came from non-life. This eternal one, this eternal living one, God, created life. And then the evolutionary stuff. Again, there are already scientists saying that we don't observe it, and it doesn't really make sense. The mutational mechanism just doesn't fly. Instead, this living, eternal God created different kinds of biodiversity and then allowed within these different kinds of species the ability to adapt. And so you do have adaptation, but it's limited. And it's not that he created one thing and from that came everything. So those are the things you would have to believe if you with an atheistic worldview, as far as I can tell. And all three of those sets of ideas are anti-scientific. And so you can believe that, and I'm going to continue to say there's a much more scientific way to think about this than saying matter and energy came from nothing, life came from non-life, and complex living organisms came from simple single-celled organisms. There's a better explanation. So the Genesis 1 creation days were literal 24-hour days. Of course not. It's just a story invented by people who had no idea how planets form. So this brings me to an interesting idea here, that there is a great deal of, I don't want to call it arrogance, but people really do look at the Genesis account and say we're too smart for that now. Now you've just heard me lay out this idea of people saying there was a big bang where matter and energy came into existence from nothing, which breaks the first law of thermodynamics. You've heard me just say that people believe in abiogenesis, that life arose from non-life, which is a contradiction of the law of biogenesis, that life comes from life. And you've heard me talk about the problems with evolution. Those to me are stories that come from people who have no idea how life formed. Like, that's really what that is. And so the arrogance there, but then what's interesting to me is you can ridicule that story, and then your story is Big Bang, abiogenesis, and evolution. I think those people would say, like, okay, I don't know what a cell is and what DNA is, but there's that doesn't happen. Matter doesn't pop into existence from nothing, right? And so even those people might say, yeah, that doesn't make sense. You saying there's absolutely nothing, and then all of a sudden matter and energy popped into existence. And so these are the stories that you have to believe. And so it makes a whole lot more sense that there was a supreme intelligence that was responsible for all of this than the alternative of Big Bang, abiogenesis, and macroevolution. So, who in his right mind would think that men had any idea at that time? Well, your assumption, Christian Ice, the assumption there is that the Bible is completely the product of men and that it is not inspired by the Creator. And so when you operate from that perspective, you're saying, how could people know any of this? But I would ask, there are aspects of the Torah that you ask, how would people know this? For example, in the Torah, the scripture says that the life of flesh is in the blood. Our first president, George Washington, had physicians that cut him to drain bad blood out, and he died from complications of that. We're talking about the early 1800s, maybe late 1700s. I have to look up the exact dates. You can look that up. They were still doing bloodletting less than 250 years ago. But the law of Moses tells you that the life of flesh is in the blood. So cutting somebody and draining the blood out, you would know not to do that if you understood your Bible. Now, my question is, how do they know that? Because nobody else in the world knew that. And all of these other pagans and people that had different religious books or whatever they had were eating blood. They were doing all kinds of things like that. And of course, something like bloodletting was probably a ritual. We can see in the book of First Kings that the prophets of Baal were cutting themselves and letting the blood gush out and all of that stuff. But the Hebrew people knew thousands of years ago the life of flesh is in the blood. And there are all kinds of things like that in the Torah. Things that how would you know something like that? Because you didn't get it from somewhere else. You didn't get it from any of the people around you. So the question I would ask is, who in his right mind would think that men had any idea about the life of flesh is in the blood? Who would come up with such a thing? Because nobody believed that around the world. But we know that even 250 years ago, we didn't completely understand that. And so there's this idea that like we just have it all figured out right now. And there's stuff we don't even understand that is right there in the Torah that they understood. Or that not even that they understood, but God gave them that truth. And this is an important idea here, that what we find is truth in the Bible. Things that just don't change, things that are true all the time. Now, there are things that we think of as true. So, for example, you might think that evolution is true, but once we are able to definitively reject that, because it's that is increasing. And again, if you know anything about the scientists that are really working hard at this, they're having these meetings and they're saying this isn't it. And so I think in my own lifetime we'll see that get discarded. It's not true. And so so it'll be cool to see that in the next few years, as again, even atheists say, no, this doesn't make sense. This doesn't line up with anything. It's philosophical. It's not scientific. So how would they have known about the life of flesh being in the blood? How would they know something like that? When you look at the Genesis 1 account and you see how things would have been made, how do they know something like that? Now you say, well, that's just a story. But I mean, there are other things that we know. So for example, there are recipes for antibacterial soap in the Torah. Now they don't call it antibacterial soap, but we now look at the ingredients that they used, and they were to use this type of water mixture that God told them to use to clean and to cleanse themselves. How would they know how to make antibacterial soap? And so the question is, how do you explain that? Now you can explain it by saying, "Oh, well, they just kind of happened upon it." But we now know that they had these this stuff from God. It was inspired. So that's an easier and a simpler explanation than trying to say, well, they just kind of came up with it, which is what people say. So yeah, if you already don't believe that, okay. I'm just I'm thankful for all of these comments, because I'm genuinely. My sister was telling me that she thought that when I started doing more of this kind of content, that I would get maybe more opposition in the comments, and I've just still been surprised by all of this. There are people calling me a liar. There are people that are saying I'm being deceptive, uh, and that would mean that I actually believe something different, and that I'm coming on my YouTube channel publicly putting my name on something that I actually don't believe. And I don't know what to do with that. What would be the reasoning for such a thing? So I don't know. It's I think I appreciate Junebug Computer because they said, like, I can tell that you believe you're speaking truth, right? And so, yeah, that's the only reason to get on here, like to deceive somebody. I don't know. That doesn't make any sense to me. So, faith and science are not compatible at all. Faith deals with baseless assertions of the supernatural. Science deals with demonstrable facts and empirical data. So, if that's true, demonstrable facts and empirical data, where is then this is why someone has to say that you have to believe in macroevolution because there are no demonstrable facts and empirical data for macroevolution. So you're correct on the science part that that's what science is, but you're just not right about faith. Faith deals with baseless assertions of the supernatural. And I write about this in my new book that just came out a few weeks ago, that everybody has faith in things. Faith, trust, confidence, belief, those are all synonyms. And one of the things that people often do who are not believers is they want to define faith in this different way of uh, being a baseless assertion of the supernatural. But that's not it. That's not what faith is. Baseless. I'm not really trying to have Bible study on here right now necessarily, but um, BibleGateway.com. I'll show you one of my favorite scriptures in 1 Thessalonians 5. First Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 21. Test all things. Hold fast what is good. When you're talking about the Bible, people often think about the Bible as being something where you're just not supposed to, that faith means just accept something that is baseless. No, that's not what it means. You say, yeah, that is what it means. No, it's actually not what it means. So here's another passage. John chapter 20. Jesus has risen from the dead. He had been crucified 3 days earlier. So he'd been crucified and he's risen from the dead. And he goes and he appears to his apostles. But one of them was not there. His name was Thomas. So the disciples say to Thomas, we've seen the Lord. What does Thomas say? I need to see the evidence. And unless I can see the print of the nails in his hand and put my finger in the print of the nails and put my hand into his side, I will not believe. Now, Jesus could have said, I want him to believe anyway, and I'm not going to appear to him. He could have said that. But the thing about the apostles, by the way, is that they all needed to be eyewitnesses of the resurrection. Now, I know right now you don't, if you're somebody who doesn't even believe in God, you don't want to hear about this, but I want to show you that the entire script, the entirety of scripture is based on stuff. It's not baseless. So even Jesus, who is come back from the dead, goes and he appears to Thomas. And this is what it says. After 8 days, so a week later, that's how they would have said a week later back in ancient times. They would have said 8 days later. His disciples were again inside. Thomas is with them. Jesus came, stood in their midst, said peace to them. And what did he say to Thomas next? Reach your finger here and look at my hands, and reach your hand here and put it into my side. Do not be unbelieving, but believing. Now, if believing is simply about accepting something that is baseless, Christ has no reason to come and appear to Thomas. He should just require him to just believe in this baseless supernatural thing. Because what happened was supernatural. He was dead on the cross and he came back from the dead. Did he require his apostles to just believe it without actually interacting with him personally? No. So the nature of faith is not this baseless assertion of the supernatural. What did Thomas say? My Lord and my God. And then Jesus says an interesting thing that I think is relevant to this entire discussion. Jesus said, Thomas, because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. So yes, there are going to be people, myself included, that have not seen the risen Christ. And Jesus knew that there would be people that would believe because they didn't actually see. But the people that initially went out, the people that he sent out to tell about his resurrection, were people that had actually seen it. Now, if it's true that faith is just dealing with baseless assertions of the supernatural, then it doesn't make sense that Christ would do something like that. But when we understand that's not what faith is, we could go back to Hebrews chapter 11, that faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. What does that mean? That means that there are things that, no, we haven't seen it. And that's where faith comes in. But it doesn't mean just because that it is the substance of things hoped for, just because it's the evidence of things not seen, doesn't mean that you have no evidence that leads you to faith. Of course you do. That's what apologetics is about, showing you the evidence that leads you to faith. The way I like to explain it is if you have a man who is married and he believes his wife is faithful, then that's a belief that he has that is based on something. Now, you might say to that man, your wife's unfaithful to you. And he's going to say, no, she's not. Now, you might say, well, you just believe in, it's just a baseless assertion. But the thing is, the difference between why he believes his wife is faithful is going to be different from him having to explain it to you. And the same thing goes with this. Sometimes people are asking me questions about what I believe regarding the scriptures. And it's because I've already seen enough evidence to get me to the place where I understand that God exists and that the Bible is his holy book, and that the third is that Christ rose from the dead according to that book. Now, for those of you who aren't there yet, that's fine. But to require me to talk like I don't already have that understanding doesn't make sense. So if you ask me a question and you don't make it clear, hey, I'm an atheist, so I want to know why you believe this, then I'm going to just tell you why I believe. But if you say, hey, I'm not an atheist, or I am an atheist, can you explain to me why you believe that a God exists? Now we can have a conversation. What is a little, I don't want to call it irritating, but it is the hostility that people have when they come on in these comments right now. I'm really wanting to really turn that temperature down, right? There's a hostility here where it's like faith and science are not compatible at all. Science began with believers. I'm curious, what do you say to that? Because that's just historical fact. Science began with believers. It began with people who believed that God exists and said, I want to explore this world and observe things and come to understand how the lawgiver did what he did. So when we talk about these scientific laws, like the laws of thermodynamics, like the law of biogenesis that we mentioned tonight, if there are laws there must be a lawgiver. And so science began with believers. And so just because in the last few decades, science has kind of been taken over by a lot of people who are not believers, to say it's not compatible, it betrays a misunderstanding or just an ignorance of the history. You just don't know the history. And the idea that all of the people that are scientists today are not believers is just also, you're not even aware of how many people are believers today. And so there's this lie that you've been told. So, and I can understand why Satan would want that. He wants you to associate this observational science with atheism. It's just not. It's not just true. It's just not true. So faith is just the excuse people give for a belief when they have no credible reason to believe it. So my question is this: what is the credible reason to believe that information, for example, in DNA, arose randomly? Well, the credible reason is, well, evolution, right? Like you have, so these beliefs that you have, I believe it was Richard Dawkins that said evolution allows me to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. Why does he say that? Because before evolution came along, everybody looked at you like you were crazy to say that there was no God. How do you explain all of this? And that was before they knew anything about DNA. And now we know more. And so now that we know more, the same question arises. How do you explain this? And if your answer is Big Bang, abiogenesis, and evolution, that's just not going to hold water. It's just scientifically, it just doesn't hold water. And so if you can't even, and so if you are saying that that stuff is science, it is not. But if you're saying that that's science, but then trying to ridicule me for saying no, as an engineer saying I'm looking at engineering designs that are far exceed anything that we've ever done, and you're trying to tell me that that just came about. Okay, your biology professor can tell you that, but your biology professor doesn't do engineering design, so they can't tell you. They can tell you that it's not design because it's not their lane. But yeah, I don't think so. So here, faith science, oxymoron again. Science literally began with believers. So you can say it's an oxymoron just because there are a bunch of people that say they do science today that would claim to not be believers. But by the way, this is why I named the podcast Faith Science. I wasn't expecting to get this much hate on it, but I guess okay. So presupposition is just ignoring the need for verifiable evidence to evade evidence and based read based discussions. They don't get anything right as their God is the God of Genesis, and that God does not exist. The Bible was written by men. I agree that the Bible, physically was written by men. What we're saying is that they were inspired by God. And so, this is something. But if you don't believe in a God existing, right, and you jump straight to the Bible, you should let's just dwell on the existence of God first. And look, give me an atheistic. I would be I would love for the atheists here. Give me something that makes some sense. Big Bang, abiogenesis, and evolution. I that's funny. It's Big Bang, abiogenesis, evolution. BAE, Bay. Like Bay doesn't make sense. All right, Bay doesn't make sense. Now I'm gonna have to use that. Okay, Bay does not make sense. Big Bang, abiogenesis, evolution doesn't make sense. And so give me something. That's not science though. Come on, like really. That's not science. And so please give me something better than that. So you can come and try and so like I would like to think that you're coming at, my belief in God and my belief in the Bible, but if let's say I'm wrong. Big Bang, abiogenesis, and evolution is what I would come to. Like I got a PhD in mechanical engineering. You're gonna have to do better than that. So please, that's not going to work. Um, so you can say the Bible's written by man. You are just making assertions. Everybody makes assertions. This is always interesting to me when people say you're just making assertions. Everybody makes assertions. So anything that you say, even anything that I state, is something that I am asserting. To say I'm just making an assertion, argument by design is pretty inept, as the universe looks undesigned, and if humans were designed, the designer is grossly inept. What's your background? Because my work is in engineering design. So what is your background that you can say something is not designed? If humans were designed, the designer is grossly inept is a wild statement, by the way. Like, okay, I'm almost at an hour. I need to stop. That's a wild statement, though, that the human body is not designed. I'm trying to think about how you would come to that. By the way, that's an assertion. That's an assertion that you just made that I think is a wild one, though. Like, because we could just start rattling off the system, that it is a system of systems. These systems work together to do the things it does. So you might look and say, well, I think the knee should be different or the shoulder should be different. But that doesn't mean, by the way, those arguments, the technical term is dysteleological arguments. This is what this person came up with. This person is making a dysteleological argument. It means an argument from poor design. Argument from poor design, the problem with it is, even if you concede that the design is not good, it's still a design. But to look at the human body and say that the designer is grossly inept. What do you design, by the way? That has any level of complexity that even remotely approaches the human body. Please tell me, what do you design that's like that? Are you in engineering design like my background is? So so when you make these statements, what are they based on? Or are they just making assertions? So it's always interesting to me that people that say, well, you're just making assertions, and then they proceed to just make assertions. It's like, but you just did that. So I'm trying to give you the benefit of the doubt here, but you're coming on making assertions that are like, to say that you don't observe design in the universe, that you don't observe design in the human body. I don't know how to even answer that, except to say your work is not in design. It must not be. And so, or design of real systems that have to do something. Maybe you design web pages or something, but like you don't. And again, correct me if I'm wrong. I've never come across an engineer that talks like that. I never come across someone who designs things that talks like that. It's only people that don't design things and they say I could do better. Well, do better. Like my work is with humanoid robots. Please show me a humanoid robot that's anything like the human body. That even remotely is close. They don't exist. And if you could come up with something better, please do. You'll make a lot of money, by the way. Since I see that you believe in a literal 6 days, and that is clearly disproved by all of reality. See, what does this mean? What does it mean? How do you disprove the beginning of the universe? How does reality disprove that? It doesn't. It's just an assertion. Your specific God of the Bible has been disproved for nearly 200 years. How? So you can make these assertions, but it's always interesting because and maybe it's just a reflective thing where because you just make assertions, you're telling me that I'm just making assertions, but you're saying things that just aren't true. Few people believed in that 6 day nonsense until the Seventh day Adventists just plain made things up. The Genesis account is over 3,000 years old. The idea that nobody believed the Genesis account until a couple hundred years ago. Like, I mean, I don't even know how to answer these things because we're talking about the Genesis account is 3,000 plus years old. So the idea that nobody believed it is, of course they did. You read the account. It is narrative. It's meant to be taken literally. If you don't think so, you can go to Exodus 20. We talked about this in that video, so I won't re-litigate that or rehash that. But the idea that nobody believed in Genesis 1 and 2 until a couple hundred years ago, when this book is thousands of years old, is again just on its face. It's an assertion that you can make. But again, I mean, I guess I could do it, but do you really want me to go find people prior to the Seventh day Adventists that believed the Bible? Of course people believed the Bible, right? Like I don't know. I don't even know how to answer that. Did people believe the Bible before the Seventh day Adventists? Yes, they did. Right? Were there Christians around believing the Bible? Were there Jewish people that believed the Bible before the Seventh day Adventists for thousands of years? Yes. So just again, historically, that's just not accurate. And I don't know how you make such an assertion. Okay. Maybe if you weren't making your living with this, you would start to rejoin reality someday. Not making so making a living with this? You'll have to go back and look. I have like 78 subscribers, man. Like making a living with this? No, I have a PhD in mechanical engineering and I work with robots. So making my living with this. So again, there are errors in this. So I mean, if this looks like I'm making a living with this, I appreciate it. Like I'm a if you think like I'm a full time content creator or something, um, but no, I'm not. I'm a engineer, entrepreneur. I make no money from YouTube. I want to get to where it's monetized, but I'm a long way away from that. All you have to do is compare what you think the universe is versus what it really is. It is very old, and the earth is very old. There was no great flood. Sorry, but that is just reality. So, again, assertions. No evidence, just assertions. And so I'll go through and maybe I'll probably just link to this video, but there's a bunch of assertions here. And this is generally what's happening. People will say things like that God doesn't exist, assertion. The Bible was written by men, assertion. Argument by design is pretty inept, assertion. If humans were designed, the designer is grossly inept, assertion. That there were how saying that things are disproved by reality is a really interesting assertion. It's like, okay, how do you disprove something by reality? Because I'm saying that this is what God said happened. You weren't there, so how would you disprove a 6-day creation? You actually can't do that. So your specific God of the Bible has been disproved. How? Please offer some evidence when you're saying something like disprove. And making my living with this, wow. Like if this looks like I'm making my living with this, then I really appreciate it. Like I feel like I have a long way to go to get to a level where I would even monetize the channel. But no, I don't make a living with this. And so the idea of rejoining reality, it's like, again, what are your credentials? What is your background? What do you work on? And so if you're working on design stuff like me, if you have degrees in engineering like me, then let's talk. But if you don't have those things, it doesn't mean that you can't be right, but it does mean that I'm putting myself out here, I'm putting my credentials out here, but then I'm having people come making assertions and then offering no evidence, nothing. There's nothing for me to respond to here except to say, says you. And I don't want to just say, says you. Like, give me something to chew on here. Give me something that you say, no, Big Bang because of this. And I'm going to say, again, Big Bang, abiogenesis, evolution, that's not going to get it. Bay, that's not it. That's all the ones I have here. And so I will go through and respond to these. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 that it's saying I haven't responded to, but I thought there were like 9 or so. And so I might find those other ones later and respond to them. But this was good. And again, got to kind of like respond in real time on these. And so I'll probably just point these people to this video. But out of those, 6 or so, Junebuck Computer, really appreciate that comment. Really thoughtful. I don't agree with some of the stuff that's said there, but it's thoughtfully done. For everybody else that is just being hostile, now not everybody was hostile. I think, you know, like Walter, that wasn't hostile. But people saying that who in their right mind, like, okay, so somebody has to be crazy if they're a believer. Um, someone saying you need to rejoin reality while giving zero evidence. Those are the kinds of things that I'm having to respond to here. And it's like, hey, give me something. Give me your evidence. Please give me your evidence so I can respond to it. But you're just making assertions and saying I'm wrong and then offering no evidence. And I'm saying I'm offering evidence. And again, all of this is a response to a video that's was really meant for believers to say, hey, these are literal 24-hour days if you're a believer in the scriptures. And so there's all this other stuff that I'm responding to now, which is, again, interesting to me. But yeah, that's all for tonight. I need to upload this video and I need to get ready for bed so I can get after it in the morning. So see you next time.